More than 3 decades ago, Howard Zinn popularized the phrase, "a people's history," to mean an alternative to official histories which are written by the elites and are meant to preserve the status quo. The purpose of an awareness of a people's history is so that we can know how we really got where we are, or at least more perspectives on it, and how we can move forward. We have a very astute guide in Professor Dean Emily Towns, who has already shared her wisdom with us this morning. Before we have the honor of hearing her again, I would invite you to look at the screens for a brief biography. Emily Towns is the Dean of the Divinity School at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, where she is also the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Professor of Womanist Ethics and Society. She holds a PhD from Northwestern University, master's and bachelor's degrees from the University of Chicago, and is the author of 4 books and the co-editor of another 2. Towns, who was born in Durham, North Carolina, came to Vanderbilt from Yale Divinity School, where she was the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of African American Religion and Theology and Associate Dean of Academic Affairs. Previously, she was Professor of Christian Ethics at Union Theological Seminary. Dr. Towns continues her research on women in health in the African diaspora in Brazil and the United States, and currently serves as president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Please welcome back Professor Emily Towns.
Thank you. As we say in Nashville, howdy. It's good to be with you this afternoon and to do this People's History of Race, at least my version of it, and I want to be very clear, this is only my version of it, and we'll hear other voices with microphones later, and they're also your voices. So together we come up with our history. I grew up in a deeply Black religious world that was filled with the smells of lemon polish on church pews, nurses in white uniforms who helped revive those who were caught up in religious ecstasy and then collapsed, or those who were just showing out. Fiery preaching, quiet preaching, good sermons, pitiful sermons, and exceedingly bad sermons. The choirs of my growing up years ranged the gamut from wonderful to those who made a joyful noise, literally, to the Lord. In Sunday school, we were taught about the miracles of the Bible, the importance of faith, the love that the sweet baby Jesus had for each of us, and that he loved all the little children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. And I believe this, and still do, with all my heart and soul. I was a Black middle-class girl in the South in the late 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. This filled me with a host of experiences and memories that continue to shape me today. I learned about race from the Black and white folks around me, and it was an education that puzzled me because the racism that often flows from the ways we think about race made and continue to make absolutely no rational sense. Rather than begin with a people's history of race in this talk, I will make a womanist move into the particular. First, and tell you a story from my personal history of race in order to move to a larger conversation. When I was in the 3rd grade, I decided to read every book in my elementary school's library. Looking back, I cannot say just how large an undertaking this was at the time, Fayetteville Street Elementary School was like many black public schools of that era, segregated by color and resources, contained in that one large room that I thought was absolutely huge through my 8-year-old eyes. Like so many spaces of my youth that appeared huge at the time and tended to shrink in size as I have aged. But then it was an enormous room. And even better, it was an enormous room filled with books. Our teachers, like Mrs. Carter and Ms. Walker, paid for things to supplement our learning out of their paychecks, and all the kids ended every sentence we spoke to an adult with ma'am or sir. I am not sure I undertook the challenge as a quest for knowledge, though that was sure to come. No, I thought it was one of a great adventure to see if I could read every book before I left for junior high as a way of testing my reading ability and the fact that the books were there, calling to me as one of those odd children, as many adults would say, who loved reading and mourned each summer coming because that meant school was out and the fun of organized learning was 3 long months away. So I set off in my adventure, starting from the far side of the library, picking up book after book. The first sections of books were Greek and Roman mythologies. I'd never heard of such from Reverend Moore's weekly sermons, and certainly not in Ms. Miner's Sunday school class. This was my personal quest, and I loved carrying it on by myself until I hit the encyclopedia at the far side of the room, just a few shelves away from attaining my goal. It was late in my 4th grade year when I braced myself as I picked up the first World Book Encyclopedia and began to read. I was in the S volume when I hit the article on slavery. Actually, it was like a gut punch. This was 1964. I was old enough to understand fire hoses and sit-ins and picketing, marches, and President Kennedy's assassination. I was being raised by parents who took great pride in being black folk who carried themselves with dignity, as did the other adults in our community and in my church, and passed this on to my playmates and me. What did I find that sucked the wind out of me in that article? Cartoonish and offensive caricatures of black folk eating watermelon, stereotypes of smiling black folk working in the fields, a monstrous cavalcade of sambos and mammies and pickaninnies. And so with all the righteous indignation that I, a now 9-year-old, could muster, I went to the librarian and my teacher with my fingers marking the page in the encyclopedia. They could tell from my face that something was wrong. All I could do was open the page and say, "This is not right." They too were stunned and assured me that they would deal with this. When I got home that night, my parents, and told my parents what I had found at school, we took our copy of the S volume off the shelf and were relieved that the more recent edition they had purchased did not have these offensive caricatures. It has been 50 years or more since I began my library adventure and discovered that dated S volume. And the teachers did handle it. I imagine the teachers went marching to the principal's office akimbo, and the principal agreed to buy the newest edition that no longer had those violent images. And that old set of encyclopedias were taken off the shelves even before the new ones arrived. How many versions of that S volume do we have in our academic disciplines, in our churches and seminaries, in our communities, in our hearts? And how can you and I model what my teachers did and provide others with larger and more accurate visions of who we are and how we can be in the household of God? We sometimes forget the power of this kind of organic education that raises most, if not all of us. We learn about race from the people around us, and we see it in the media, what we do or don't experience in our communities and cities, what is taught in our religious households. And within this education, we are often taught to dream, to use our imagination to build a better place for all of us to live in, to see new images that counter fire hoses, police dogs, Fergusons, Baltimores, lynching trees, Charlestons, and so much more that devalues and denigrates life. These are the harsh and demonic stepchildren of what I call the fantastic hegemonic imagination. And this is just a fancy way of saying this type of imagination traffics in people's lives to create caricatures of who we are that then become stereotypes. But we think they are true and historic. And the rich diversities in our midst are seen as overly sentimental distractions rather than as flesh and blood and spirit. This imagination conjures worlds and their social structures that are built on the ordinariness of evil. It is this imagination that helps to hold systematic structural evil in place, because we pass off its caricatures as knowledge, and it spawns generation after generation as we teach to oppress. So enter counter-memory as imagination that liberates and educates for transformation. The use of counter-memory refuses to measure all of our realities by ideological stereotypes. It resists the scatological moonshine of the gross commodification of human lives in which peoples are reduced to profit margins or name-brand products. There are days when I lean heavily on counter-memory because it can sometimes feel like I and others are rearranging the deck chairs on our pedagogical and theological Titanics when it comes to dealing with incredibly complex bodies that are often fueled by heterosexism, empire, racism, imperialism, homophobia, and far too much more. The deadly pipe dream of post-racial is a tool of the fantastic imagination. Post-racialism, to my mind, is a don't worry and why the hell aren't you happy mentality that thrives on simplistic analysis masquerading as ultimate solutions. Things like having a black president means that we don't have to talk about race anymore. Believing, feeling, and acting as though we are past racism when we put Obama in the White House, and let's ponder that image for a moment, is inept social analysis and an inarticulate understanding of how deeply embedded isms are in our imaginations and our actions. Race matters, as Cornel West pointed out so well in 1994, and it continues to matter today. And furthermore, even if we had accomplished something about racism directed at black folk, we have done little to address that directed at Latinos and other skinned than white folk in this country. Consider the arguments we hear that we should not worry about race, as the Supreme Court and other courts and legislatures in this country continue to chip away at the Civil Rights Act because we don't need it anymore. Our response? Black Lives Matter. Stay woke. Student protests at Vanderbilt, Yale, Princeton, University of Texas at Austin, Hampton University, Temple University, University of Missouri, and many more, using die-ins, sit-ins, hands up, don't shoot, chalking, teach-ins, and more, being led by young black folk and their allies who understand the importance of building cathedrals of resistance and hope in the midst of the despair of our times, refusing to believe that we have made this country the land of the free because they can see with their lives that this simply is a bald-faced lie. We've still got work to do. Consider talking about race and racism as on a black-white binary alone. Yes, we still have tons of work to do to work through a past that includes enslavement and owning people as a Christian and godly thing to do. But there is so much more in our racist society to address because we must include how the color coding of U.S. society is black, white, brown, olive, and more. Facing our history and our present realities about race is a complex thing if we are going to do it well, because at some point, all of us are implicated as oppressors. And most of us don't want that label for the things that we do. But we must, so that we can get to work and become allies and freedom fighters for more than our self-interests. Counter-memory on race can teach us that the new day has already dawned, and it is once again being led by a younger generation than many of us, if not most of us, in this room. These freedom-fighting younger folk are not the cheap trick stereotypes of millennials as either self-entitled narcissists or open-minded do-gooders. These liberation-leaning younger folk have sparked a smart and strategic movement for social change that refuses to leave Michael Brown's body lying in state on Canfield Drive, speaks out loud Sandra Bland's name, recognizes the deaths of Manuel Angel Diaz and Yoel Acevedo are as horrific as Freddie Gray and Eric Garner, brings before us the depths of Rexdale Henry, Sarah Lee Circlebear, Alan Locke, and far too many more Native Americans who have died in police custody, climbs the pole with Bree Newsom to pluck evil out of the air, using counter-memory to face our past, present, and future, teaching us something many of us already knew or felt, that focusing on heterosexual, cisgender men frequently cause us to not see the significant amount of labor and thought leadership that women provide to movements, not only in caretaking and auxiliary roles, but on the front lines of protests and in the strategy sessions that happen behind closed doors. That old model of leadership favored the old over the young, attempted to silence gay and lesbian activism, and did not recognize the leadership possibilities of transgender people at all. And that movement focused on its singular leader or a few visible leaders is vulnerable because those leaders can be easily identified, harassed, bought off, and killed. New organizing is focusing on building and maintaining a leader-full movement. Facing race demands all of the siblings of the racism and our inarticulate but deadly constructions of race grow up alongside of it. our failing system of public education, which is a school-to-prison pipeline for many Black and Latino youth. The need to dismantle the prison industrial complex to end the problem of mass incarceration of Black and Latino and poor whites. Safe and affordable housing, accessible, affordable, and excellent health care for all, food security and reproductive justice, challenges affecting poor women and all people needing access to reproductive care, countering the intentional exclusion of trans lives with the pointed inclusion of trans folks in leadership and as spokespeople for change. Our history of race has led us to an intergenerational movement today if we will accept the challenge. Yes, there have been schisms and battles between younger and older freedom fighters about tactics and strategies. Today, the movement leaders practice a clear rejection of the respectability politics ethos of the civil rights era with its belief that proper dress and speech will guard against harassment by police. Within Black communities, there is a point of tension between being caught in a system that makes one feel powerless to change it and the belief of the idea that a good job being well-behaved and having proper dress and comportment will protect us from the evils of racism. Belief in the latter feels like this is something we can do to protect ourselves and have some control over our destiny. Be it Black Lives Matter, Native Lives Matter, Latino Lives Matter, each rejects such thinking in the face of massive evidence of police mistreatment of darker-skinned peoples and poor peoples of all classes and backgrounds. It argues that all people should be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how one looks or speaks. And frankly, this sounds religious to me. So I began with Jesse Helms in the World Book Encyclopedia, an interesting twosome, to prime the pump for my people's history of race. I suggested that our imagination, the fantastic sides of it, work against us as we think about race, and then argued for the remainder of my talk that counter-memory can help us face ourselves, our realities, and one another. What I have not yet said is that this means that you and I must be willing to tell the truth. For without truth-telling and truth-listening and hearing, counter-memory does not have any chance at all in countering the fantastic imagination that makes us afraid of one another. An imagination that builds moats around our hearts, makes our faith a sham, and encourages us to believe that only folks like us are the inheritors of God's grace. If we do nothing else, we must stop spiritualizing our iniquities when it comes to race and all of the isms. When we fail to stop these inept kumbayas and sashaying alleluias, our faith becomes more of a barrier than a bridge to help us see the humanity in one another, regardless of race, gender, sex, sexuality, age, ability, nationality, ethnicity, and all the other ways we call ourselves living beings. If we think we have already done this work, think again. Look around. Listen to the voices of those who continue to cry out for justice. If your body is not beside them, if your mind is not attuned to the thick crap of evil, if your soul does not cry with them, if you think you've done the work, think again. It is my hope that as we continue our sacred conversations for racial judgment, that we, as those in the Black Lives Matter movement, say, stay woke.